Okay, colleagues, we are now on Group 16, Muirburn. I call Amendment 204 in the name of Tim Eagle, grouped with Amendments 205, 206. Tim Eagle to move Amendment 204 and speak to all amendments in the group. Mr Eagle.
The risk of wildfire in Scotland is rising. Over the last decade, there has been at least 1,500 wildfires recorded. Last month, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service issued an extreme risk of wildfire, the first alert of its kind since 2020, reflecting the exceptional conditions across Scotland this year. Muirburn, the controlled burning of vegetation, is important in the process of limiting wildfire by removing combustible materials, primarily heather. It is carried out by those with significant experience, estates, gamekeepers and land managers. However, in 2024, the Scottish Parliament passed the Wildlife Management and Muirburn Scotland Act, which will prevent anyone from making Muirburn on land without first achieving a licence. After 2 delays due to stakeholder concern, the licensing scheme is due to come into force at some point next year. Now, the effect of this may be that less people are able to make Muirburn, or people will stop Muirburn altogether, curtailing the obviously necessary work to prevent the devastating events that took place at Carbridge and Darver in the Cairngorms this year from taking place again. Licensing, in my opinion, will only make it harder for skilled and deeply experienced land managers to carry out preventative Muirburn. This will see combustible fuel loads increase and potentially the loss of those in the industry who played such a vital role in containing the recent fires. Please believe me when I say we have decades, if not hundreds of years of experiences in the intricacies of moorlands in Scotland, living in our rural communities. We risk losing generations of knowledge that has been passed down. For those reasons, my Amendment 204 would repeal the Muirburn licensing scheme, removing it from the 2024 Act. This would ensure that effective wildfire prevention is not curtailed by overbearing licensing conditions. Whilst it would be preferable that the scheme is repealed in its entirety, my Amendment 205 seeks to find a common ground between those seeking to keep some sort of licence in place and those concerned that the licence could see wildfires increasing. This amendment seeks to remove one of the conditions related to Muirburn licensing. Currently, the 2024 Act sets out the specific conditions where a Muirburn licence may be granted. If the land to which the application relates is peatland, the Act requires it to be proven that the making of Muirburn is necessary for the specified purpose and no other method of vegetation control is practicable. Amendment 205 deletes the specific requirements for peatland, as it has proved unworkable in practice. And I'll just briefly touch on Ariane Burgess MSP's Amendment 206. I am concerned that this will alter the definition of peatland in the 2024 Act to cover that which is 30 centimetres thick and above, the current definition being 40 centimetres thick and above. That would potentially bring more land under the specific scrutiny and restrictions on Muirburn licensing relating to peatland. At this time, when Scotland faces such a risk from wildfire, I believe it would be irresponsible to widen the definition and potentially restrict necessary preventative Muirburn on a wider scale than is already envisioned, so I won't be supporting that amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Eagle. I now call Ariane Burgess to speak to Amendment 206 and other amendments in the group. Ms Burgess.
Thank you. Amendment 206 seeks to make a technical change to Muirburn provisions in the Wildlife Management Muirburn Act, passed by Parliament last year. It set a definition of peatland for the purposes of requiring a licence to practice Muirburn. The definition was one of the most contested parts of the bill, and it was agreed by Parliament to amend the definition of peatland from land with a peat soil layer of at least 50 centimetres down to 40 centimetres. Many environmental stakeholders felt the definition should be even lower, 30 centimetres. We heard compelling evidence from scientists with the IUCN's peatland programme about the fragility of shallow peat soils. Indeed, Scottish Greens would prefer to see the practice of Muirburn banned entirely, with all peat soils protected from the effects of burning. Just a few weeks ago, Natural England, in setting its own Muirburn licensing scheme, has set a lower definition of 30 centimetres. And this now means that a greater range of peatlands will be protected in England than in Scotland. With the introduction of Scotland's licensing scheme being delayed for another year by the Minister just weeks ago, there is now sufficient time to amend the legislation and guidance ahead of the autumn 2026 Muirburn season. My amendment would bring the Scottish Muirburn licensing scheme in line with England and increase the extent of peatland in Scotland that is protected from Muirburn without a licence.
call Mercedes Vialba.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Scottish Labour supports Amendment 206 to update the definition of peatland in the Wildlife and Muirburn Scotland Act 2024. This is something we have repeatedly raised throughout this parliamentary session, and we see no reason why this cannot be done today. If the Scottish Government is not able to support this reasonable amendment, we'll expect to hear why and how it will be addressed, for example, in the upcoming Natural Environment Bill. Thank you.
I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Before I address the individual amendments, I want to address the Muirburn licensing scheme that this Parliament agreed as part of the Wildlife Management and Muirburn Scotland Act 2024. Now, I fully understand the concern from practitioners around Muirburn, especially in the context of this year's wildfires, which is why the Scottish Government announced a delay of the licensing scheme until the start of the next season in autumn 2026. Doing that gives us more time to carefully consider how these necessary changes to licensing can be brought forward in a way which doesn't adversely affect our ability to prevent and respond to wildfires. Now, we remain committed to ensuring that Muirburn is carried out appropriately and safely and in a manner that ensures our environment does not suffer as a result. So that's why I cannot support Tim Eagle's amendment to repeal the Muirburn licensing scheme in its entirety. Stakeholders see the benefit to increased training, professionalism and regulatory oversight the legislation provides for those undertaking Muirburn. So I therefore recommend that members oppose this amendment in the Land Reform Bill as well as Amendment 205. Now, regarding Ariane Burgess's Amendment 206, the depth of 40 centimetres was agreed by Parliament during the passage of the Act last year and can be changed, if appropriate, using regulations, so primary legislation is neither required nor appropriate. Now, many stakeholders have already completed peatland surveying work to 40 centimetres, so this amendment also has the potential to undo all of that hard work. And further to this, the increasing risk of wildfire requires that any change to the definition of peatland would need proper consideration and assessment to ensure it does not have the opposite effect of its intention to protect peatlands. So I would therefore ask that members oppose this amendment.
Thank you. I call on Tim Eagle to wind up press or withdraw Amendment 204.
Press amendment. I've got nothing further to add.
Thank you, Mr Eagle. The question is that Amendment 204 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. Votes closed. Point of order, Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was logged out of the system. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Mr Doris. I will ensure that is recorded. And the result of the vote on Amendment 204 in the name of Tim Eagle is yes 25, no 87. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 205 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 204. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Move.
Question is that Amendment 205 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And votes closed. And the result of the vote on Amendment 205 in the name of Tim Eagle is yes 28, no 90. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 206 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 204. Ariane Burgess, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 206 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division of members who cast their votes now. And the vote's closed. Point of order, John Swinney.
President, I'm afraid I was unable to be connected and I would have voted no.
Thank you. I'll make sure that vote is recorded. The result of the vote on Amendment 206 in the name of Ariane Burgess is yes 27, no 91. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 207 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 305. Ariane Burgess, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That is not moved. Takes us to Group 17, Private Purpose Trusts. I call Amendment 208 in the name of Rhoda Grant, in a group of its own. Rhoda Grant to move and speaks to Amendment 208.
I move Amendment 208. The amendment will improve transparency of land ownership in Scotland. It seeks to modify the Trusts and Succession Act to target private purpose trusts. 1 in 5 properties owned through offshore companies don't disclose publicly who owns them, representing £3.2 billion for 670 properties in Scotland. Of these, £1.2 billion worth of properties are controlled by complex trust arrangements to keep their owner's identity secret. These trusts can be used to obscure those who ultimately benefit from land or property in Scotland. It can be a bit like a Russian doll, set of layers hiding the ultimate owner. Land Reform Scotland Act 2016 introduced the Register of Controlled Interests in Land, which launched in 2022. However, the Register of Controlled Interest in Land does not require registration of beneficiaries as a matter of course. As it stands, private purpose trusts could effectively hide land ownership for the purpose of the Register of Controlled Interest in Land, unless the provisions in the Trusts and Succession Act are amended so that private purpose trusts should not be able to be used to conceal beneficial owners. This is the policy intent behind this amendment, and I would urge the Cabinet Secretary to support it, or failing that, give a commitment to bring forward legislation to tackle this, not only in the context of land reform, but throughout wider society.
Thank you. I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Firstly, just to say that I was grateful to meet with Rhoda Grant about Amendment 208, which removes trust property, which is land, from the definition of a private purpose trust. However, as drafted, the amendment would not have the intended effect because such trusts could continue to exist and still be set up anew under Scots law. The amendment will therefore have no effect on existing trusts of this nature, and it wouldn't stop new trusts of this nature being established. Now, this government views it as essential that we have in place the highest anti-corruption standards, which includes information about beneficial ownership. That's why we have committed to looking closely at private purpose trusts as part of an anti-corruption strategy in our next Open Government Action Plan. Now, that plan will take a wide-ranging approach and will look at private purpose trusts in all contexts and not just land ownership. And I hope that this commitment to comprehensively address the issue offers the necessary reassurance. Now, ministers have been clear decisions about this part of the 2024 Act will rightly only be made after that work has been completed. So for these reasons, I would ask Rhoda Grant not to press an amendment.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant to wind up, press or withdraw Amendment 208.
Given the assurances of the Cabinet Secretary, I will not press my amendment.
And Rhoda Grant is seeking to withdraw Amendment 208. Does any member object? No member objects. Therefore, Amendment 208 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 314 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 311. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
That is not moved. I call Amendment 315 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 311. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
That is not moved. I call Amendment 316 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 311. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
And the question is that Amendment 316 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote's closed. And the result of the vote on amendment number 316 in the name of Ross Greer is yes 9, no 88. There were 20 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Brings us to Group 18, licensing land on which certain birds may be killed or taken. I call amendment 317 in the name of Mark Ruskell. In a group on its own, Mark Ruskell to move and speak to amendment 317. Mr Ruskell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 18 months ago, Parliament passed the Wildlife Management Muirburn Act, introducing a licensing scheme for shooting red grouse in Scotland. And the policy intent of that legislation was for the whole area of an estate to be included in the licence, given that gamekeepers are normally employed to undertake predator control over the entire estate. Now, a loophole in the legislation is allowing grouse moor managers to specify a specific part of an estate to which the licence is to apply to, essentially the grouse moor itself rather than the surrounding land of the estate. And this is concerning, given that incidents of raptor persecution often occur outside of the grouse moor itself. And I'll simply reflect on the fact that since this bill was passed, we've seen continued raptor persecution happening across Scotland, and this is deeply concerning. We need to get to grips with this. So, for example, the nest sites of some birds, like buzzards and goshawks, are usually found off the grouse moor area, and these nests can be a target for those that want to persecute them. So, Amendment 317 seeks to close that unintended loophole, clarifying that a grouse moor licence would cover an entire landholding, keeping the licensing scheme in line with the intention of Parliament. Now, because of these concerns, Nature Scot has attempted to plug this loophole with a new licence condition, but it is considered by many to be unworkable. So this condition requires that where a raptor persecution offence occurs away from the specified licensed grouse moor area, there needs to be evidence to link it to the management of the grouse moor for any consideration of a sanction to take place. And those bodies that are experienced in the investigation of such offences agree that obtaining evidence of a link, even with a civil burden of proof, will be virtually impossible to achieve in most cases. So this new condition that Nature Scot have brought in does not allow consideration of other relevant offences, such as those relating to badgers or animal welfare. However, the fact that Nature Scott have sought to plug this loophole with a condition really confirms the original intention of the Scottish Government to include the whole estate in the grouse shooting licence and to apply the full agreed list of offences. Now, I brought a similar amendment at stage 2. I have reflected on the comments that were made at the time, as well as points that were raised by a range of stakeholders. And as such, I've made some technical changes to the drafting to take account of, firstly, cases where a grouse moor is managed by a sporting agent, and secondly, the definition of contiguous land. Now, in moving this amendment, I do note that the Minister has recently, I believe, written to the Rural Affairs Committee confirming that the intention of the Government is to fix this issue, not in this bill, but in the Natural Environment Bill, which we'll be considering in just a few weeks' time, lucky us. So, on the basis of that, and on the basis of what I hope will be an explicit commitment given by the Government here tonight, that they will address the issues that are raised under 317 and take that forward in consideration at stage 2 of the Natural Environment Bill, I will not move this amendment. But I do consider this to be a campaign and a mission in parts, Presiding Officer, and I look forward to that hopefully being brought back to the Rural Affairs Committee in a few weeks' time.
Thank you. I call Tim Eagle.
Well, it's good to hear that Mark Ruskell won't push this amendment tonight, and I look forward to the debate that will come in the Natural Environment Bill. But it's not a loophole, Presiding Officer. I think that's a really unfair comment. Now, with the greatest of respect to Mark Ruskell, this Amendment 317 falls into the ideological trap of assuming the worst of landowners, who in so many cases are actually active parts of their community and want to meet the rules as laid out in the Wildlife and Muirburn Act. Amendment 317 would widen the land area covered by Section 16AA licences, which regulate red grouse shooting. It's worth noting that many recognise that grouse shooting provide important economic, cultural and environmental benefits in rural Scotland. There is absolutely no evidence to support claims that landowners are exploiting a loophole by licensing only small areas, which the member is asserting. Nature Scott have reported no raptor persecution linked to grouse moor requiring intervention, yet Mark Ruskell has just stood up and said there is. So I don't know what to believe. Nature Scott has reported, ministers have confirmed that no licences have been issued covering only narrow strips of land, such as around grouse butts. I'm happy to take an intervention.
Mark Ruskell.
Simply point out to Tim Eagle that we have seen continued raptor persecution. And of course, landowners that are law-abiding have got absolutely nothing to fear from a licensing scheme. Nothing to fear at all. But I would point out to him that we've already seen a peregrine and an osprey found shot in the Angus Glens last autumn and a red kite in Strathdon earlier this year. Open your eyes, Mr Eagle, to what is actually happening.
Through the chair, Mr Ruskell. Tim Eagle.
I think the point I'm trying to point out, though, is not that there aren't problems, because there are wider problems in Scotland, but that Nature Scott themselves have confirmed that there is no raptor persecution linked to grouse moors, whereas what the Greens are trying to do here is expand this licensing scheme in a way that is completely unnecessary. Official documents from the Wildlife Management and Muirburn Scotland Act 2025 make clear that licences apply to land where grouse are actually taken or killed, not whole estates. This was not challenged during the bill's passage. Nature Scott already has powers to include licence conditions to address offences outside licensed areas, providing flexibility without changing primary legislation. This amendment, for me, makes an assumption which is unfair and not based on evidence, and I will look forward to debating it during the passage of the Natural Environment Bill.
And Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As I set out at stage 2, I understand the concerns that have been highlighted by Mark Ruskell, and we engaged on some discussion around that then. As Mark Ruskell has also highlighted, Nature Scott have implemented an additional condition on all grouse licences to try and resolve the concerns that this amendment is seeking to address. However, the condition doesn't include the full list of relevant offences and requires reliance on licensing conditions as opposed to express provision in the primary legislation. As it's already been raised tonight, the Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity confirmed in a letter to the convener of the Rural Affairs Committee last week that he will bring forward an amendment at stage 2 of the Natural Environment Bill to address the uncertainty surrounding the interpretation of the licensing provisions. So this will ensure that the licensing scheme operates in the manner which I think members intended when they voted to pass the Wildlife Act 2024. Now, being lodged at stage 2 of the Natural Environment Bill will allow the amendment to be scrutinised and debated alongside other wildlife management legislation. So I would therefore recommend that members oppose this amendment, though I do appreciate Mark Ruskell has said that he's not intending to move it. Thank you.
Thank you. Call Mark Ruskell to wind up. Press the withdraw Amendment 317.
Don't have anything more to add. Look forward to the debate to come, and I won't be pressing the amendment.
Okay, Mark Ruskell seeks to withdraw Amendment 317. Does any member object? No members object. Therefore, Amendment 317 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 318 in the name of Douglas Lumsden. Already debated with Amendment 305. Douglas Lumsden, to move or not? Moved. Question is that Amendment 318 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division. The members should cast their votes now. And the vote's closed. The result of the amendment on amendment number 318 in the name of Douglas Lumsden is yes 44, no 72. There was one abstention. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 319 in the name of Douglas Lumsden. Already debated with Amendment 305. Douglas Lumsden, to move or not move? Moved. The question is that Amendment 319 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division. The members should cast their votes now. And the vote is closed. And the result of the vote on Amendment 319 in the name of Douglas Lumsden is yes 46, no 71. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Brings us to Group 19, Moorlands. I call Amendment 320 in the name of Rachel Hamilton in a group of its own. Edward Mountain to move and speak to Amendment 320. Mr. Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Ms Hamilton has asked me to move this amendment on her behalf. Amendment 320 requires the Scottish Ministers to produce a report on moorlands, including what proportion of land in Scotland is moorland and the rate of moorland habitat loss broken down by region and the land uses that are replacing moorlands. And this is a consequence of the proposed changes within the Land Reform Act. The amendment is drawn from the study produced by the Heather Trust, which found overall that Heather moorland the size of Birmingham is lost every year in the UK. Research showed that 60,000 square kilometres of moorland in Scotland was lost between 1990 and 2023, in comparison with just over 600 square kilometres during the same period in England. It also highlighted that moorland is being replaced by grassland and woodland, particularly woodland in Scotland, and that there is likely to be a reduced pressure on moorland and habitat loss from the further expansion of more woodland in the future and land reform. Critically, the report found that there is a lack of limitation of data in terms of what's replacing moorland, which is what this amendment hopes to address. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I call the Cabinet Secretary.
I want to start by setting out that I, of course, appreciate the importance of moorlands. The restoration and regeneration of Scotland's ecosystems, including but not limited to moorland, is at the heart of the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy. However, as drafted, the amendment isn't practical. The terms in it aren't well defined, and this sort of work should be considered in the round with other biodiversity and land use work streams. It's also not helpful for moorlands to be considered in isolation from other ecosystems, and the requirements in this amendment are too prescriptive. So we therefore encourage members not to support Amendment 320.
Thank you. Edward Mountain to wind up, press or withdraw Amendment 320.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. I would actually come back and say that this amendment, as laid by Rachel Hamilton, is specific enough. It clearly says what proportion of land in Scotland is moorland, a straightforward question. A quick survey would find that out. The rate of moorland and habitat loss broken down by region, that's possible to do as well. The Cabinet Secretary has talked about people doing survey of peatlands already, and the land use is replacing moorland. Surely we can do that. We do it in the agricultural censuses in most years, and what the consequences of that moorland loss would be. I believe it is possible to do it. It may add another burden on the government, which they may, Presiding Officer, not want to agree to, but I don't see why it isn't specific enough or detailed enough to allow this vital record to be kept. I therefore move the amendment, Presiding Officer.
Okay. The question is that Amendment 320 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote's closed. The result of the vote on Amendment 320 in the name of Rachel Hamilton is yes 47, no 71. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 321 in the name of David Torrance, already debated with Amendment 232. David Torrance, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Okay, the question is that Amendment 321 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is closed. Point of order, Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I voted yes.
Thank you, Mr Sweeney. I'll ensure that vote is recorded. And the result of the vote on Amendment 321 in the name of David Torrance is yes 25, no 85. There were 7 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 322 in the name of Douglas Lumsden, already debated with Amendment 305. Douglas Lumsden, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 322 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is closed. And the result of the vote on Amendment 322 in the name of Douglas Lumsden is yes 24, no 91. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Move to Group 20 I call Amendment 323 in the name of Ariane Burgess in a group of its own. Ariane Burgess to move and speak to Amendment 323.
This amendment brings back a proposal I brought at stage 2 to make it easier to lease public land for the purpose of creating hutting communities. And I wish to thank the Scottish Rewilding Alliance for their support to develop this amendment. The hutting movement in Scotland involves the creation of small off-grid huts in the countryside, and these low-impact informal dwellings are important for giving more people the chance to live closer to nature and to spend time on our land. They provide a base for outdoor activity, they enable a closer connection to the environment, they encourage the development of new skills, and they provide a platform for the creation of cohesive communities. Many members will be aware of the Carbeth Hutters community, which has been in community ownership since 2013. The vast majority of hutters have a keen interest in their hut's surroundings, and they can enter into management agreements with public bodies, for example, woodland management agreements with public bodies, and including low-impact management of woodland that may otherwise not be viable commercially. There could also be the opportunities to contribute to citizen science data collection on local ecology. My amendment would require the government to publish a model lease for hutting. Currently, no government-endorsed model lease exists for public bodies seeking to create plots of land for hutting, and a lease has been trialled at Carnock in south-west Fife to enable a group of hutters to build 12 huts on the National Forest estate. This could form the basis of a model lease agreement to be used by other public bodies. I encourage members to support my Amendment 323 so that more people across Scotland can benefit from the opportunity of leasing public land to establish new hutting communities. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Edward Knighton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I listened to that, and there's much with what Ariane Burgess says that I can agree with. Living closer to nature, getting to know your surroundings and becoming one with the environment is something that I would all try and promote. My problem is with this lease is there's no definition of how that can be achieved in planning law. I'm not sure how hutting fits in with local planning legislation regarding zoning and proliferation without control. To me, it's slightly dangerous, and I'd be very happy if the member could set my mind at rest in how that would fit in. I'm happy to take an intervention, Ms. Burgess, on how it fits in with local planning as regarding control. Otherwise, huts could be established in many locations with little or no knowledge. Perhaps the Cabinet Secretary will have more details, and I'm very happy to listen to them.
Has Mr Wellington concluded his comments?
Sorry, I have concluded, yes.
Thank you. I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. Hopefully I can address some of the members' concerns in relation to this. But just to set out, first of all, that I absolutely share Ariane Burgess's aspirations for this kind of land use. Like a button ben, hutting aims to get people closer to nature, with, of course, all the social and health benefits that follow from that. And this lease would allow huts to be used for recreation or for occasional occupation. I recognise some of the points that Edward Mountain was making in his comments there, but just to outline that planning guidance on hutting has been produced by Stirling Council, and I would hope that other councils would follow suit from that. And good practice guidance on the planning, development and management of huts has previously been produced with input from the Scottish Government Planning and Architecture Division. So I think that we can build on this work to deliver a model lease for hutting on public land. That's why I'm happy to support this amendment from Ariane Burgess, because it helps make hutting really more accessible for communities right across Scotland, and I would ask members right across Chamber to support it too.
Thank you. And I call Ariane Burgess to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 323.
Thank you. Nothing much more to add, but just to point out that this amendment is focused specifically on public land, just as my other amendments around community energy were about public land. So it's about giving communities an opportunity based on our public land. So it's not going to happen all over the place. It's going to happen in a very specific way, and building on the work that's been done, as the Cabinet Secretary points out. I move the amendment.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 323 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 323 in the name of Ariane Burgess is yes, 91, no, 27. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. We now turn to Group 21 on small land holdings. I call Amendment 209 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with the amendments as shown in the groupings. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 209 and to speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The amendments in this group build on the modernisation and consolidation of the Landholders Acts and ensure that small landholders will benefit from a modern legal framework that's fit for the 21st century. Frankly, I was quite astonished last week at Edward Mountain's comments when he said that this government has failed to grasp the nettle effectively and had parked small landholdings on the back burner. But I think it's important to get it on record. This is the only government to bring forward significant modernisations for small landholders in nearly a century. Now, turning to Amendments 377, 388 and 391, these modernise the process for a small landholder and their landlord to resolve disputes in other ways than requiring them to go to the Land Court. Now, this process generally mirrors that for tenant farmers and their landlords, enabling them to access alternative forms of dispute resolution, such as arbitration. These alternatives can, in some scenarios, resolve disputes more flexibly and at less cost than going to the Land Court. Now, Amendments 210 and 212 ensure that the Tenant Farming Commissioner's codes of practice and reports into alleged breaches of the codes are appropriately taken into account when parties use arbitration to resolve disputes. Amendment 369 relates to smallholders' security of tenure and clarifies that a lease of a small landholding cannot be for a fixed duration and can only come to an end in certain circumstances which are set out in the schedule. Amendments 370 and 372 remove the reference to holiday lets, ensuring consistency with the regulation of short-term lets in Scotland. Amendment 390 expands the jurisdiction of the Land Court, which currently includes matters under the Landholders Act, to also include matters under the schedule. Amendments 209 and 371 make minor technical drafting changes, and my other amendments 367, 368, 378 to 387 and 389 relate to the repeal of the Landholders Acts, which are being replaced by modernised provisions in the schedule, except where the provisions need to be kept in force, and they also make other consequential changes. Now, the amendments also modify the retained provisions regarding statutory small tenancies, including to apply the modernised provisions in the schedule where relevant, and amend the 2 existing routes for a statutory small tenant to become a small landholder to ensure that they operate alongside the schedule. Finally, I've been really pleased to work with Tim Eagle following Stage 2 on Amendments 373 to 376. These amendments modify the consultation requirements on ministers before exercising certain delegated powers under the schedule and reflect my commitment to working positively with stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Tim Eagle to speak to Amendment 373 and other amendments in the group. Mr Eagle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. At Stage 2, I lodged amendments to change the consultation requirements for Scottish ministers when exercising various powers in the schedule. I have worked with the Cabinet Secretary, for which I am very grateful on this topic ahead of Stage 3, and now bring forward amendments 373 to 376. These amendments either modify existing or introduce new consultation requirements on Scottish ministers. Amendments 373 to 375 expressly require Scottish ministers to consult persons they consider appropriate before laying draft regulations under certain powers in the schedule. These are paragraph 40, paragraph 49 and paragraph 50. Amendment 376 amends the current list of people that ministers are required to consult before laying draft regulations under subparagraph 1. This power allows ministers to make regulations in relation to a small landholding, registering their interest in buying their holding. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Edward Mountain.
Very briefly, Presiding Officer, I'd like to say that I too welcome some of the amendments within this group. I just make the observation that with the amendments that you had at Stage 2 and the amendments that we have at Stage 3, we are probably at the level of 2 amendments for, 4 amendments for every small holding in Scotland, which seems an awful lot of amendments when the original suggestion was to include them within the rest of the agricultural holdings legislation.
Thank you. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary to wind up.
I have nothing further to add. With that, Presiding Officer, I would just move Amendment 209.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 209 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is agreed. I call amendments 210, 211 and 212, all in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and all previously debated with Amendment 209. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move amendments 210 to 212 en bloc.
Moved en bloc.
Thank you. Does any member object to a single question being put on amendments 210 to 212?
Just separately.
Okay. We will now then proceed to call each amendment separately. So I call... the question rather is that Amendment 210 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 211. Previously debated with Amendment 209. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. Sorry.
She's moved in. All you have to say is the question is that
The vote is now closed. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendment number 211 in the name of Marie Goujon is yes, 88, no, 26. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. And I put the question that amendment 212 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Point of order, David Torrance.
Apologies, Presiding Officer. I could not connect. I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Mr Torrance. Your vote will be recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 212 in the name of Marie Goujon is yes, 89, no, 26. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. We now turn to Group 22, Tenant Farmer Advisory Forum. I call amendment 213 in the name of Rhoda Grant in a group on its own, and I call Rhoda Grant to move and to speak to amendment 213. Ms Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move amendment 213. This amendment gives the Tenant Farmer Commissioner power to establish a Tenant Farming Advisory Forum. Tenant Farmer Advisory Forum that sits at the moment is not underpinned by legislation. Neither does it provide tenant farmers with fair representation. The bulk of the membership is representative of landowners' interests rather than those of tenants. The forum is chaired by the Tenant Farmer Commissioner and attended by the following stakeholders: the Scottish Agricultural Arbitrators and Valuers Association, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, the Agricultural Law Association, Scottish Land and Estates, the National Farmers Union of Scotland and the Scottish Tenant Farmers Association. The professional bodies have been represented by land agents and solicitors with strong commercial ties to their landlord clients, and on some occasions they have been represented by farmer board members from Scottish Land and Estates. Such strong landlord bias is not constructive to the aims of the forum, given the ability of the majority to stifle debate and delay progress. In recent years, many important issues discussed at the Tenant Farmers Advisory Forum include improving the process for tenants to register their preemptive rights to buy and dealing with deer damage compensation for hill farmers that have been left unresolved. This amendment seeks to put the forum on a legislative footing to ensure that organisations that support the aims of this bill and more progressive land ownership in Scotland are more fairly represented. Vested interests are a dead hand on the forum, and therefore I urge members to support this amendment.
Thank you. I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I agree with the sentiment behind Rhoda Grant's amendment and the need for a more balanced TFAF membership to ensure that tenant farming interests are properly balanced with those of landlords. Now, TFAF have a really important role to play in supporting the tenant farming sector, and as we go forward, their role needs to adapt to ensure more voices are heard from across the tenanted sector. But before legislating in relation to this, it is important for the Scottish Parliament to enable time for a proper review. This will, in particular, give the new Tenant Farming Commissioner time to bring forward change in the way that TFAF operates. But make no mistake, if significant progress cannot be achieved through changing the current ways of working, Scottish ministers will explore whether more fundamental changes to the status and operation of the forum are needed. But I would just want to highlight that we wouldn't need primary legislation for that, as ministers already have a power by regulations to modify the functions of the Tenant Farming Commissioner. So for all of these reasons, I would therefore ask members not to support this amendment.
Thank you. I call on Rhoda Grant to wind up and to press or withdraw amendment 213.
Given the reassurances that the Cabinet Secretary has given, I will not press at this time.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant seeks to withdraw Amendment 213. Does any member object? No member objects. Amendment 213 is therefore withdrawn. We now turn to Group 23, Changes to Agricultural Tenancies. I call Amendment 90 in the name of Edward Mountain, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. I call on Edward Mountain to move Amendment 90 and to speak to all amendments of the group. Mr Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move Amendment 90 at the outset. I would just like to remind, and I want to make this point fairly clear to the Parliament, that I am a tenant under the Agricultural Act 91. I'm also a tenant, an agricultural tenant, under a non-agricultural lease, which is now covered by the 91, the 2003 or the 2016 Act. I support tenancies, and it's always been my intention in this Parliament and in my practice as a private surveyor to increase the amounts of tenants in Scotland. I believe agricultural tenants in Scotland are the way forward. And certainly for people when they seek to retire from being actual farmers, possibly look for tenants to take on the role of farming it until the person's children return to carry on farming. Sorry, is that an intervention? Oh, sorry. I apologise for drawing attention to that. I misheard. I want to encourage tenancies across Scotland, and I'd like to see more tenants. My amendments in this group are all to do with retrospective changes to agricultural tenancies, which I fundamentally disagree with. Amendment 90 mandates the respective changes to legislation only apply to new agricultural tenancies, where the agricultural lease was entered into before the day of the Land Reform Act gaining royal assent. Modifications made to this chapter are not applicable to the tenancy. Amendments 91 to 95, 97 to 104, 106 to 112 remove sections of the bill which make retrospective changes to the tenancy, which I've explained I fundamentally disagree with. Let's be clear, land letting in Scotland to tenants is declining. Very few landlords are prepared to offer agricultural tenancies at the moment, as they are terrified of the kind of retrospective changes this bill is bringing in. In the year 2000, Presiding Officer, there were over 19,000 holdings with rented land. This figure had declined to 13,738 in 2024. That's a reduction of 29%. In 2000, there were nearly 1.8 million hectares of rented land in Scotland. Again, this figure has declined to 1.3 million in 2024. That is a loss of 27% of land in agricultural tenancies, or 500,000 hectares. That is significant. A 29% decrease in rented holdings and a 27% reduction in hectareage must not be ignored. The Cabinet Secretary, in my mind, and this government must take ownership of the fact that retrospective changes to agricultural legislation, such as this land reform bill, are undermining confidence in the tenanted farming sector, which I think is wrong. Furthermore, during the meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee on the 17th of December 2024, I asked 4 witnesses, Hamish McLean, Martin Hall, Tom Oates and Andrew Wood, if this bill would encourage more tenants into agriculture and increase the tenanted farm sector. All 4 of them said no. In 2016, the last land reform bill was passed. It was defective, and the Cabinet Secretary at the time, Richard Locke, had forced the ending of various tenancies because of the way the legislation was enacted. This resulted in the famous Salverson versus Riddle case, which was the tip of the iceberg, where tenants with agricultural leases were forced off the land. This has cost the government a huge and yet undisclosed amount of money, all due to unwise and retrospective changes to legislation. If the government learned nothing, in my opinion, Presiding Officer, from this, it should be that they should not make retrospective changes, which is why I move these amendments in my name, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Before I comment on the detail of Edward Mountain's amendments, I have to say that I am, quite frankly, astounded at the position he appears to want to place the tenant farming sector in, because these changes, the majority of which have been driven by tenant farming stakeholders, are needed to enable tenant farmers to engage in the agricultural reform programme. His amendments 91 to 95, 97, 98, 100 to 104 and 106 to 112 would remove much of the package of important changes in Chapter 3 of Part 2 of the bill and significantly limit the benefits to the tenant farming sector. If these amendments were agreed, only sections 10, 19 to 22, 26 and 27 would remain in Chapter 3, and I would therefore strongly urge members to reject these amendments. And finally, the intention behind Amendment 90 is for these changes only to apply to agricultural tenancies entered into after the bill receives royal assent. I just cannot support that approach. I consider it would undermine the effectiveness of the reforms, be unworkable as drafted, and mean that any current tenant farmers would not benefit from these changes, which are essential. In particular, given that few secure 1991 Act agricultural tenancies are now entered into, the majority of our tenant farmers who are secure 1991 tenants would be left behind. These reforms are absolutely essential if tenants are to make a decent living on their holding, improve the land they work, and work in a way that promotes sustainable and regenerative agricultural production. It's important that all tenant farmers and their landlords benefit from the range of important measures that are in this bill. So for these reasons, I urge members across all parties to oppose the amendments in this group.
Thank you. I call on Edward Mountain to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 90.
And thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm disappointed to hear the words of the Cabinet Secretary. No, I am a tenant under a 91 tenancy and I agreed to the terms thereof. That's what I signed up to. That's what I was prepared to commit to. And I'm happy with those agreements. I have a very good working relationship with my landlord. As far as the other tenants' provisions, I don't want to stop the market. But my feeling is, Presiding Officer, that the Cabinet Secretary, by raising these amendments, are certainly going to stymie the market. I have given the Cabinet Secretary the evidence of what has happened in the last few years, which is all due to retrospective changes to the law. It would be rather like, Presiding Officer, going off and agreeing with somebody a contract to do something, and then for the person who was providing the goods for that contract to be told that somebody could come along and change it. It happens in no other business, and it is bad for business, and it stops that, in this case, tenants getting onto the land. So I don't accept the arguments that the Cabinet Secretary has made. I want to try and create a vibrant sector, which I think will only be achieved if we stop fiddling with the legislation that's already been passed. Presiding Officer.
Mr Brennan, can you just clarify whether you're pressing or withdrawing Amendment 90?
I am pressing Amendment 90.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 90 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Point of order, Ben Macpherson.
My vote didn't register. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Mr Macpherson. Your vote will be recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 90 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 25, no 89. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We now turn to Group 24, Agricultural Holdings, Right to Buy. I call Amendment 324 in the name of Tim Eagle, grouped with Amendments 325, 326, 327 and 214. I call on Tim Eagle to move Amendment 324 and to speak to all amendments in the group. Mr Eagle.
Well, I move the amendments in my name. The amendments 324 to 327 conserve the consultation requirements on Scottish ministers when exercising certain powers to make secondary legislation in connection with the pre-emptive right to buy process for 1991 Act tenancies. The amendment makes equivalent changes to those in my name in Group 21 in relation to the pre-emptive right to buy process for small landholdings. Amendments 324 to 326 expressly require Scottish ministers to consult persons they consider appropriate before laying an order under two powers in the Agricultural Holdings Scotland Act 2003. These are Section 27.5, which enabled ministers to modify the list of transfers that do not require notice to be given to a tenant with a registered right to buy, and Section 28.5, which enables ministers to modify what amounts to an owner or creditor taking actions with a view to the transfer of land for the purposes of triggering a tenant's right to buy. Amendment 327 amends the current list of people that ministers are required to consult before laying draft regulations. This power enables ministers to make regulations in relation to the process for a tenant to register their interest in buying their holding. The amendment would expand the list of consultees to include those that represent the interests of 1991 Act tenants and their landlords. These amendments will ensure that ministers engage with stakeholders prior to exercising these powers, and I ask members to support them. With regard to the Cabinet Secretary's Amendment 214, I look forward to listening to the reasoning behind the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 214 and other amendments in the group. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just in relation to the amendments from Tim Eagle first, as a matter of course we consult interested stakeholders before making regulations. However, I said at stage 2 that I would work with Tim Eagle on these amendments to help address his specific concerns about engagement before making any right-to-buy regulations. So I'm therefore happy to support his amendments in this group. As part of the consultation process, my officials will offer the specific option for individuals and businesses to opt into being specifically notified when these consultations are starting. My Amendment 214 clarifies that instruments made under sections 25.3, 25.7 of the 2003 Act will be subject to negative procedure. It's appropriate given that they provide for fees chargeable by the keeper and prescription of forms of notice. So I would therefore ask members to support all amendments in this group.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I call on Tim Eagle to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 324.
Press the amendment. I have no more to add.
Thank you, Mr Eagle. The question is that Amendment 324 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 325 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 324. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Move.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 325 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
The Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 326 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 324. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Move.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 326 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
The Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 327 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 324. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Move.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 327 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Are we all agreed?
Yes.
The Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 214 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 324. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 214 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Point of order, Michelle Thompson.
Sorry, Presiding Officer, my application didn't connect, but it did connect at the last second, so I have now voted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Thompson. Point of order, Graeme Day.
Apologies, Presiding Officer. My app would not connect at all. I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Mr Day. Your vote will be recorded. Point of order, Neil Gray.
Apologies, Presiding Officer. My app did not connect. I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Mr Gray. Your vote will be recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 214 in the name of Marie Goujon is yes 88, no 25. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. I call amendments 91, 92, 93 and 94, all in the name of Edward Mountain and all previously debated with Amendment 90. I invite Edward Mountain to move amendments 91 to 94 en bloc.
Moved en bloc.
Thank you. Does any member object to a single question being put on amendments 91 to 94? No. The question is therefore that amendments 91 to 94 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast a vote now. The vote is now closed. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendments number 91 to 94 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 26, no 90. There are no abstentions. The amendments are therefore not agreed to. We now turn to Group 25, Resumption and Termination. I call Amendment 328 in the name of Tim Eagle, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. I point out that if Amendment 338 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendments 217, 218 and 219 by way of preemption. I call on Tim Eagle to move Amendment 328 and to speak to all amendments in the group. Mr Eagle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move Amendment 328 in my name. My amendments in Group 25 look to make improvements to the process of resumption and tackle some of the deficiencies as I see them in this section. Amendment 328 inserts timeframes noting when a notice of resumption needs to be given, which will give clarity and sufficient time for the tenant to be able to organise themselves, making the process fairer for both parties and less ambiguous. Amendment 329 removes the ability for a tenant to terminate their tenancy if they receive a notice of resumption within 6 weeks. This adds fairness into the legislation but would avoid the landowner suffering due to a quick termination of a tenancy. Amendment 330 is a consequential to 329. The bill allows for tenants to be paid compensation following resumption in addition to existing additional payments. My Amendment 331 deletes the ability to receive compensation in addition to an already achieved additional payment. My amendments 332, 333, 335 to 337, 339 and 342 to 44 make minor drafting or wording changes. Currently, the bill notes that an independent advisor with knowledge of land valuation will be appointed to value the land. That person should be able to value agricultural land. Amendment 334 deletes that and instead requires them to be able to value the tenant's interest in a leased or agricultural land. 338 deletes the existing functions of the valuer and instead requires them to ensure that compensation is fair if a tenant is left no better and no worse off had resumption not taken place. 340 amends the part dealing with the amount payable by landlord to tenant. It deletes part and it highlights how the tenant's interest in the resumed part is to be assessed. The bill valuer is to serve a notice on relevant parties specifying certain matters during resumption. Amendment 341 deletes some matters which need to be included in that. Presiding Officer, in the interest of brevity, I will simply say I am content to support both the Cabinet Secretary's and my colleague Edward Mountain's amendments in Group 25. However, I do not support Emma Harper's MSP's Amendment 347, as I think it's excessive to add these provisions to the existing list of requirements to the Tenant Farming Commissioner's Code of Practice, provided for in the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Edward Mountain to speak to Amendment 215 and other amendments in the group. Mr Mountain.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Amendments 215 to 219 ensure that the compensation for resumption is done on the basis of the value of the land if sold with vacant possession for its existing agricultural use rather than hope value if the land was sold for development. The reason is for that is that people enter into agricultural leases to use the land for agriculture, not in the hope that there may be some development at a later stage which they can benefit from. To use that valuation will further undermine the confidence in the tenanted farming sector, and I refer the Parliament and the Cabinet Secretary to my earlier remarks in Group 23 on the decline of the sector, with 29% decline in holdings with rented land. Amendment 96 inserts further amendments to ensure that the value of land being resumed under the 2003 Act tenancies is specifically qualified to determine the open market value as determined by and laid down by the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, rather than simply appearing to the landlord to meet the requirements to be a valuer. That is just ensuring quality. Independent bodies all agree that resumption of the land within the bill is a mess and not fit for purpose. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware of a letter sent to her on the 3rd of October by the heads of independent bodies, including NFUS, Agricultural Law Association, Scottish Land and Estates, the Central Association of Arbiters and Valuers, Scottish Agricultural Arbiters and Value Association, and the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. That letter details the problems within this section of drafting, which stipulates that compensation should be in relation to the capital value of the land itself, not what it was rented for. The Scottish Tenant Farmers Association are the only stakeholder who have not offered their support to this letter, and I don't think it's right that one organisation should have the power to veto all the other organisations' sensible views. Turning to other amendments in the group, Amendment 328 in the name of Tim Eagle allows flexibility and for the landlord and tenant to reach an agreement, which is exactly what, in my mind, this bill should be encouraging. Amendment 338 is also a very sensible amendment, and if the Parliament passes it, it will preempt my amendments 217, 218 and 219, and I'm quite happy with that. However, if the Parliament does not pass 338, then I'm afraid I will have to push my amendments individually. I will not comment on Emma Harper's Amendment 347, except that I think it adds little to the process. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. I call in the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 345 and other amendments in the group. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think before I respond to Tim Eagle's amendments and the others in the group, I think it's important to set out where we've reached, both for clarity for everyone in Parliament, but also for tenant farming stakeholders. I have listened carefully to stakeholders' views and made changes where that's the right thing to do. There is a need to ensure fairness for tenant farmers who lose possession through a resumption or an incontestable notice to quit. Now, in 1991 Act resumptions, the measures in the bill are both right and fair. It's important to keep in mind that the capital value method has been used before with no challenges for similar claims. I've also listened to concerns from tenants about disturbance payments being too low, but the argument that the reorganisation payment should be changed has not been made. My Stage 3 amendments 345, 346, 363, 364 and 365 seek to ensure that the bill continues to provide a balanced solution for both sides while providing a transparent legal framework. It is, of course, rarely possible to get total agreement on controversial issues. A bit of give and take is to be expected. But it is also right that we keep these matters under review as we continue Scotland's land reform journey. And it's for that reason that I'm seeking new powers to provide for compensation for resumption under 2003 Act tenancies or after an incontestable notice to quit. Amendment 346 makes good on the promise I made during Stage 2 that I would work with stakeholders to consider again whether the capital value method for fixing compensation is the right method when land is resumed from a limited duration tenancy. It means that ministers can make regulations that change or clarify that method if it is clear that it is the right thing to do. It also addresses the concerns of landlord stakeholders about the resumption value process for 2003 Act tenancies and inserts a new section into the bill to enable Scottish ministers to make provision through regulations for the compensation elements payable to a tenant farmer with a limited duration tenancy by their landlord when part of their land is resumed by the landlord. Amendment 364 is consequential on that and assures that any resumption regulations will be subject to affirmative procedure. And my Amendment 345 also makes good on the promise I made during Stage 2 that I would work with stakeholders to ensure that additional compensation is paid to tenants who lose possession of their whole holding as a result of an incontestable notice to quit. It means that ministers can make regulations that create change or clarify the method for determining the amount of that additional compensation if it is clear that it is the right thing to do. Amendment 364 is consequential on that and ensures that any resumption regulations will be subject to affirmative procedure. We need to take into account that these are significant powers and it is therefore right that they are subject to additional procedure. Amendment 365 provides for that, with the effect that the first use of either power will need to be a super-affirmative regulation. Now, while some of Tim Eagle's amendments 328 to 344 are genuine attempts, I think, to appease landlord elements of the sector, there are flaws with them, not least because some seek to circumvent the protection of tenants' rights. Now, Amendment 328 enables parties to contract out of the statutory one-year resumption notice period. Tim Eagle might suggest that this enables both parties to make informed decisions, but what it also does is enable a landlord to apply more pressure to force a tenant to agree to a compensation value quickly on a timescale that suits the landlord. Now, while it is right that some tenant farmers and landlords have strong, successful relationships, that, of course, is not the case for everyone. We have to protect the rights of those tenant farmers who are pressurised into situations by aggressive parties. Now, on Amendments 329 and 330, these are attempts to prevent a tenant from exercising their right to terminate their whole tenancy if their landlord serves them with a resumption notice. I don't know what Tim Eagle is attempting to achieve by this, because all it does is set to erode the hard-fought-for rights of Scotland's tenant farmers. His Amendments 331 to 334 seek to reverse the reforms in the bill and to make money for the landlord. 331 reduces the compensation payable to the tenant, as it requires other claims that are now paid separately to be deducted from the resumption payment. Amendment 332 changes the method of compensation so that it relates only to the tenant's interest in the part of the lease being resumed, moving it away from the capital valuation approach taken in the bill. Now, this might seem reasonable, but the effect is that the tenant gets less than under the bill provisions, perhaps much less. Amendment 334 is a consequential amendment that changes the skills that a valuer would need to have to reflect the new requirement to value the lease rather than the land. The amendments by Edward Mountain do not propose a new method, but they do also aim at cutting back on the amount of compensation that are to be paid to the tenant. Edward Mountain's amendments 215 and 216 propose land that forms part of the resumption should be valued, but only as used at the time of the valuation. This approach is followed up in Amendments 217 to 219, which would mean that the land can only be valued with its existing use. He specifically excludes hope value and development potential from the valuation assessment. Now, of course, all of this is very technical, but I think we can let common sense be our guide in relation to this. Yes.
Edward Mountain.
And I thank the Cabinet Secretary taking intervention. Presiding Officer, my amendments are to say that when you enter into a lease, you enter into the lease for that land for agricultural use. You don't enter into the lease in the hope there's going to be a better value comes along if it's not agricultural lease. It would be a bit like renting a Mini and hoping it would turn into a Rolls-Royce. And that's what I'm trying to stop. I'm trying to just make sure that the tenant farmer gets compensation for exactly what they've entered into, not in the hope that it might have changed something else. And I'm not sure why Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary, doesn't accept that, and I'd be grateful to hear her views.
Cabinet Secretary.
Again, I'm going to set out my views in relation to that as I continue with my comments here. Because, first of all, I've seen no evidence of any kind that hope value or development value are in fact an issue when assessing the value of land for the purposes of compensation. Secondly, there is already provision in the bill. Paragraph 42C of new Schedules 2A and 2 already confirm that a valuer is to take no account of the use of the land for a purpose that is not one permitted by the lease. And thirdly, if evidence shows that there is an issue with this, then the bill includes a power that would enable ministers to fix the problem. Now, Tim Eagle's amendments 338, 340, 341 and 342 focus on valuing the tenant's interest in the lease rather than the land. Now, this might seem reasonable, and some stakeholders in TFAF are attracted to it for that reason. However, the reality is different, because the amendments leave the judgment entirely to the valuer, and the amount of compensation paid to the tenant can be expected to be significantly lower. Now, finally, Tim Eagle's Amendment 339 makes a final effort to compound and dilute valuation fairness further for tenants, aiming to ensure that Scottish ministers are unable to modify the meanings of improvement or high farming for valuation purposes. Yes, Tim Eagle.
It was just to make the point, because we've been talking about hope value there, and I think some of the concerns, as I understand them within TFAF, was that the risk around anything that would allow hope value could stifle rural development. Do you, as the Cabinet Secretary, accept that point? Which is why people, I think, were looking for comments today from the Cabinet Secretary to ensure that that wouldn't go forward.
Cabinet Secretary.
I wouldn't necessarily share the concerns in relation to that for the reasons that I set out in response to Edward Mountain and the comments that I've just made. Now, turning back to Tim Eagle's Amendment 339, this amendment only makes sense if the aim is to protect landlords at the expense of tenants, because that is ultimately the effect of the change. Now, Tim Eagle's remaining amendments 333, 335, 336, 337, 343 and 344 are all consequential to these. Now, Edward Mountain takes a more direct route through Amendment 96, which is an alternative to his Amendment 97 that we've already debated in Group 23. This amendment would require the landlord to nominate as valuer a person qualified to determine the open market value as defined by RICS. He has not, however, attempted to change the requirements set out in paragraph 1.4 of Schedule 2 in the bill. They are that the person named possesses the qualifications, knowledge and experience suitable for assessing the value of agricultural land. Now, unlike the amendments lodged by the Conservatives, Emma Harper's Amendment 347 is directly helpful to all sides, clarifying that the Tenant Farming Commissioner's ability to make codes of practice to include the process for a landlord to resume lease land or bring a 1991 Act tenancy to an end through an incontestable notice to quit. So for all of the reasons I've just set out, that's why I support Emma Harper's amendment, and I would ask members to support all my amendments in this group. But I would strongly urge MSPs from across the chamber to resist all of the Conservative amendments.
Thank you. I call Emma Harper to speak to Amendment 347 and other amendments of the group. Ms Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Apologies. Amendment 347 in my name relates to the role of the Tenant Farming Commissioner in preparing codes of practice to encourage and promote good practice in the sector. I'd like to thank the Scottish Tenant Farmers Association, the STFA, for all the support and advice that I have been given during this bill ahead of Stage 2 and now Stage 3. The Land Reform Scotland Act 2016 currently includes an illustrative list of topics that the Tenant Farming Commissioner may make provision about in the Code of Practice. In my amendment, Presiding Officer, I am seeking to add 2 topics to the list that the Tenant Farming Commissioner may make provision about. The first relates to the resumption process, which is relevant to both agricultural holdings and small holdings. In the context of the resumption process, a landlord may seek to resume land for specific purposes, such as building houses, roads or infrastructure, or for environmental or conservation projects. So I wanted to highlight this so that folks are clear as to what this means and how it relates to my amendment. The second part of my amendment relates to the process when a landlord of a 1991 Act tenancy terminates a tenancy through what is known as an incontestable notice to quit. An incontestable notice to quit is the formal notice served by a landlord to terminate an agricultural tenancy. Unlike a general or unqualified notice to quit, this type of notice is based on a specific legal grounds and does not allow the tenant to automatically challenge it by serving a counter notice. As the discussions on the amendments in this group demonstrate, these can be contentious. There is widespread anecdotal evidence that codes of practice are not being followed, but currently the Tenant Farming Commissioner can only investigate if a formal complaint is made by a landlord or a tenant. So I have been asked to raise this by the STFA and asked whether the Cabinet Secretary would respond to the STFA's request to keep under review the ability of the Tenant Farming Commissioner to investigate breaches of the Code of Practice in a self-appointed way if the Tenant Farming Commissioner has reason to believe that codes of practice are not being followed. It would be appreciated if it could be commented in Cab 6 closing. So again, the purpose of this amendment is to modify the illustrative list of matters in Section 27 of the Land Reform Act which the Tenant Farming Commissioner makes provision about in a code of practice. So I consider that code of practice do play an important role here and will be of great assistance to tenants and landlords alike. So I ask members to support my amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on Tim Eagle to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 328. Mr Eagle.
I press 328 and I've got nothing further to add.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 328 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament has not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Point of order, Bob Doris.
Presiding Officer, my phone wouldn't work. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Mr Doris. Your vote will be recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 328 in the name of Tim Eagle is yes 45, no 72. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 329 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 330 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 331 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. The question, I call amendment 332 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 333 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 334 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 335 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not move. I call amendment 336 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 215 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 328. Edward Mountain to move or not move?
Moved.
Moved. The question is that amendment 215 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament has not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. You stop. The vote is now closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 215 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 42, no 72. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 216 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 328. Edward Mountain to move or not move?
Moved.
Moved. The question is that amendment 216 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament has not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. vote is now closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 216 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 43, no 70. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 337 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 338 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with amendment 328. I remind members that if amendment 338 is agreed to, I cannot call amendments 217, 218 and 219 by way of preemption. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 217 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 328. Edward Mountain to move or not move?
Moved.
Moved. The question is that amendment 217 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Where am I? 218 next. Oh. The result of the vote on amendment number 217 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 44, no 71. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 218 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 328. Edward Mountain to move or not move?
Moved.
Moved. The question is that amendment 218 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 218 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 45, no 72. There were no abstentions. The amendment therefore is not agreed. I call amendment 219 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 328. Edward Mountain to move or not move?
Moved.
Moved. The question is that amendment 219 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Point of order, Craig Hoy.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I thought my vote had recorded, but my screen's now gone blank. I would have voted yes. I just wanted to confirm that it had been recorded.
Thank you, Mr Hoy. Your vote has been recorded.
Thank you.
The result of the vote on amendment number 219 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 44, no 72. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 339 in the name of Tim Eagle. Already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 340 in the name of Tim Eagle. Already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 341 in the name of Tim Eagle. Already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 342 in the name of Tim Eagle. Already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 343 in the name of Tim Eagle. Already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 344 in the name of Tim Eagle. Already debated with amendment 328. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 95 in the name of Edward Mountain. Already debated with amendment 90. Edward Mountain to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 95 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 95 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 26, no 90. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 96 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 328. Edward Mountain to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that amendment 96 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 96 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 45, no 72. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 97 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 90. Edward Mountain to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 97 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division. Members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 97 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 25, no 88. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 98 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 90. Edward Mountain, to move or not move? Moved. Thank you. The question is that amendment 98 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. I call George Adam for a point of order.
Presiding Officer, the voting platform seems goosed and I would have voted no.
Thank you, Mr Adam, for your technological explanation. We'll ensure that's recorded. I call Alistair Allen for a point of order.
I'll be less specific and just say that I attempted to vote no, but I don't think it recorded.
Thank you. We'll just check. Dr Allen? Okay. I can confirm your vote was not recorded, but now is. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendment number 98 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 26, no 91. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 345 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with amendment 328. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 345 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. I call amendment 346 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with amendment 328. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 346 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 346 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary is yes 91, no 27. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And we move to Group 26, Compensation for Improvements. And I call amendment 220 in the name of Edward Mountain, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. And I point out that if amendment 225 is agreed to... Oh. Oh, point of order, John May.
Presiding Officer, could you just confirm the last vote again?
346. She called it not agreed.
You said not agreed and it was agreed. It is agreed.
Ah, sorry, so that's there. Mr Mason, you've just brought something to my attention. You are quite right. The result of the vote, for clarity, on amendment number 346 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary was yes 91, no 27. Therefore, the amendment was agreed. Thank you. We move to Group... Oh, I call Maggie Chapman for a point of order.
It was the same one.
OK, thank you, Ms Chapman. I am pleased to see that my colleagues are on the ball.
We move to Group 26, Compensation for Improvements. I call Amendment 220 in the name of Edward Mountain, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. And I point out that if Amendment 225 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendments 226 and 227 due to a pre-emption. Edward Mountain to move Amendment 220 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move Amendment 220. Amendment 220 reverses the current assumption within the bill that the landlord has consented to a tenant's request for an improvement to the land if they did not respond to a notice requesting consent. Now, the reason why I've done this was the same reason that I did this in the housing bill, is that there's no stipulated way for serving notices. And I, along with many other people, probably have been caught out with mail that's supposed to have been delivered and not been delivered on the 3 days a week that I get mail, which is not always the same 3 days every week. So you can't rely on the mail. So I'm therefore, by trying to move Amendment 220, is to force a assumption. Sorry, sorry, did somebody want to intervene?
No, please continue, Mr Mountain. Sorry. And colleagues. Let's make sure we hear one another. So it's really just a question of trying to get to the situation where, if a notice is served, that both sides know it's been served and it's responded to, which is why I don't think it should be assumed it's been served and received, and therefore consent has been given. Amendment 223 is consequential to Amendment 220. Amendment 221 removes the requirement for the landlord to provide reasons in writing for the basis of the refusal for consent for the tenant's improvement. Amendment 220 is related and removes the 70-day period within which the landlord must give the tenant for reasons for a refusal, instead giving reasons for a refusal within a reasonable timescale if asked to by the tenant. Amendment 225 requires a definition of sustainable and regenerative agricultural production to be on the face of the bill, instead of obliging ministers to define it in regulation. I probably am not the only farmer looking to understand what it means. Amendment 99 means that the consent must be required for certain improvement listed on pages 61 and 62 in the schedule. These include irrigating land, making and planting osier beds, making and planting short-term coppice, etc. And it is really to clarify that consent must be required for those improvements because they are a considerable change to the land usage. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Thank you. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 224 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I promised during Stage 1 to clarify the terms of the new Schedule 5 of the 1991 Act as inserted by this bill, following evidence from tenant farming stakeholders, and made good that promise at Stage 2. Now, the amendments in my name provide further clarity where that's needed. Amendment 224 fixes a minor drafting error in Schedule 5. Amendments 226 and 227 update the list of improvements presumed to facilitate or enhance sustainable or regenerative agricultural production for the purposes of the Land Court's determination of whether to approve a relevant improvement. Now, they remove creating species-rich pasture and converting a holding to organic farming from the list because their inclusion is now redundant, as the Land Court is no longer required to approve them since they were listed in Part 3 of Schedule 5. With regard to Edward Mountain's amendments 220, 221, 222, 223 and 225, they remove and reverse various provisions in Section 14 which are key for transparency. And Amendment 99 would impose a blanket requirement for landlord consent, even where it may not be necessary or appropriate. The amendment would turn guidance into a mandatory rule, which is not the purpose of paragraph 2. It creates a real risk that some modest changes would require consent that would otherwise not need it. So with that, I would urge members to support the amendments in my name and to oppose Edward Mountain's amendments in this group.
Thank you. And I call Edward Mountain to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 220.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've listened to the Cabinet Secretary to ask members not to vote for my amendments 220 and the ones relating to that. I haven't yet understood why that it is automatically assumed that if you post a letter, you receive it. That doesn't always happen, and it doesn't stipulate whether this should be by letter form, by email form, by recorded delivery, by special delivery or any other means. So what will happen at some stage is if notice is served and the other side wishes to challenge it, it will be on the assumption that whoever posted the notice has to sign a bit of paper swearing that they've delivered the letter. Now, that to me is not a way of going forward. To me, a way of going forward is having some form of recorded delivery so that people can see the notices have been delivered and that each side understands that. So for those simple reasons, I don't accept the Cabinet Secretary's comments in relation to that. Amendment 226 and 227, in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, I agree with, which goes a long way to addressing some of the amendments that I looked at in relation to Amendment 99. And I may well be in a position to reconsider that, hearing what the Cabinet said in relation to that. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Can I just confirm, Mr Mountain, whether you're pressing or withdrawing Amendment 220?
I am pressing Amendment 220, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And the question is that Amendment 220 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. I call Richard Leonard for a point of order.
Lost connection, would have voted no, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Leonard. Will ensure that's recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 220 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 26, no 89. There was one abstention. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 221 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 220. Edward Mountain, to move or not move?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 221 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 221 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 26, no 90. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 222 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 220. Edward Mountain to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 222 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 222 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 26, no 91. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 223 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 220. Edward Mountain to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 224 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with amendment 220. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 224 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call amendment 225 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 220. I remind members that if amendment 225 is agreed to, I cannot call amendments 226 and 227 due to a preemption. Edward Mountain to move or not move?
Not moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Here. I call amendment 226 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with amendment 220. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 226 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 226 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary is yes 96, no 21. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. I call amendment 227 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with amendment 220. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 227 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 227 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary is yes 99, no 19.
There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. I call Amendment 99 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated, with Amendment 220. Edward Mountain, to move or not move?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 99 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 99 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 26, no 92. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 100 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with Amendment 90. Edward Mountain, to move or not move?
Presiding Officer, sorry, I will want to move it, but I was wondering if you cared to move amendments 100 to 104 en bloc to make voting simpler, Presiding Officer. But if that's a complication, I will purely move Amendment 100.
We are not yet there, Mr Mountain. They don't quite come at this point, so we'll just move this one.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. So the question is that Amendment 100 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 100 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 26, no 92. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We move on to Group 27, Diversification, and I call Amendment 228 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary in a group on its own. Cabinet Secretary to move and speak to Amendment 228.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Amendment 228 makes a minor drafting change to clarify the procedure when a landlord notifies the tenant that they object or are imposing conditions in relation to proposed diversification by the tenant. Now, the bill currently requires the landlord to explain to the tenant why the grounds for objecting to the diversification or the conditions imposed are reasonable. The amendment clarifies that such reasons are to be given in the same notification as that notifying the tenant of the objection or conditions imposed, and not separately. Now, these changes will help inform the tenants next steps by improving communication between landlords and tenants and ensuring that tenants receive this information from their landlord in a timely manner. And with that, I move Amendment 228.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 228 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendments 101, 102, 103 and 104, all in the name of Edward Mountain and all previously debated with Amendment 90. And I invite Edward Mountain to move amendments 101 to 104 en bloc. Does any member object to a single question? Oh, sorry, Mr Mountain.
I didn't even get to accept your invitation, Presiding Officer, which I do, moved en bloc.
Thank you very much indeed. Does any member object to a single question being put on amendments 101 to 104? Thank you. Therefore, the question is that amendments 101 to 104 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment numbers 101 to 104 en bloc in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 25, no 90. There were no abstentions. The amendments, therefore, are not agreed. I call Amendment 347 in the name of Emma Harper, already debated with Amendment 328. Emma Harper, to move or not move?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 347 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 347 in the name of Emma Harper is yes 92, no 25. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. We move on to Group 28, Game Damage. I call Amendment 105 in the name of Edward Mountain, grouped with Amendment 348. Edward Mountain to move Amendment 105 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move Amendment 105. Presiding Officer, in 40 years of managing farmland and farming, and 15 years of managing upland estates, I've never yet been able to quantify in my mind what damage to livestock game can carry out. Sheep and deer seldom mix, and deer and cattle stay apart. And I'm yet to see a pheasant or a partridge chase a cow. But if somebody could correct me on that, with their experience in the countryside, I'm happy to be corrected. I haven't seen it, and I genuinely wonder what this section is trying to achieve. And perhaps at this stage I could say, tongue-in-cheek, I don't believe that cows are frightened of pheasants. The only livestock that I've seen challenging pheasants is pigs, who seem to be intent on eating them. My Amendment 105 removes damage to livestock from the list of situations where a tenant is entitled to be compensated by the landlord for damage resulting from game or game management. Now, Amendment 348 is a simple amendment changing the definition of game within the bill to remove grouse. When I met with the Cabinet Secretary, she kindly recommended a book for me to me, which was called Fair Game, Law of Country Sports and the Protection of Wildlife by Charlie Parkes. With a little bit of help, I managed to find this on Amazon and buy it and read it. But she said to me that the reason why my amendment would be wrong on this, because grouse should be included. But I don't believe that that's what the book says. Let's be clear. Capercaillie are grouse, and capercaillie are protected by law. And let's be clear also that black game, there is a self-imposed moratorium on killing black game, which is correct. Therefore, to make the landlord liable for damage allegedly done by species, that one of which is protected by the law and the other is protected by a voluntary agreement, is fundamentally wrong. And that's what this bill is doing. The drafting, if the Cabinet Secretary meant red grouse, should have said red grouse. But to simply say grouse, which includes ptarmigan, capercaillie and black game, is a broad brush term. And I don't believe the landlord can be held responsible for something that they cannot control by law and are advised not to. I've been managing livestock and wildlife, presiding officer, for over 40 years, and this section doesn't make any sense to me, and I'd be grateful to hear the Cabinet Secretary's arguments on why I'm wrong. Thank you.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, Edward Mountain's Amendment 105 would prevent our tenant farmers from being able to claim for damage caused to livestock by game or game management. So this would mean that tenant farmers would not be able to claim compensation when livestock suffered harm as a result of the actions taken for game management purposes, such as removing fences and gates that limited access to farmland. It would also prevent a tenant farmer from being able to claim for damage caused by game when a tenant can show, for example, that game animals have transmitted disease or infection to livestock. In all cases, it will be for the tenant farmer to evidence direct and indirect game damage, and I think that's why this amendment is unfair and why we would oppose that change. Amendment 348 would prevent a tenant farmer from being able to claim for damage caused by game management techniques or equipment on grouse moors. Again, this is unfair given the range of behaviours by some sporting tenants, and it is only fair that a tenant farmer should be able to claim for damage caused to their holding during game management, such as damage caused to fencing, gates or fields. So with that, both of these amendments are unfair, and that's why I would urge members to reject them.
Thank you. And I call Edward Mountain to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 105.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I listened to the Cabinet Secretary's explanation there. I'd be interested to know, Cabinet Secretary, Presiding Officer, if the Cabinet Secretary could give me an infection to livestock that game birds can give them. I've never come across it. I'm not sure there is one. In fact, I'm 99% sure there's not one. But I'd be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary could define it as she's used it, or give me an example of it, Presiding Officer, as she's using it for her reason for denying my amendments. OK, so we don't have any. Leaving gates open and damage to livestock from vehicles moving around on game shooting days is already covered, and I believe is a simple act that tenants can claim for, and it would be something that the landlord would be responsible for. Goodness knows, I think that considering the value of some livestock that we have, the very high value, especially of pedigree cattle, most farmers would be acutely aware if they felt it was unfair, and I've had no one mention that to me. And as far as grouse moors are concerned, what we're talking about is we're defining grouse as one of the game bird species, and that includes the species, Presiding Officer, which I've already said are protected and no one can do anything about. So it seems unfair and seems, well, just blatantly wrong in law to hold somebody responsible for something which they're legally not allowed to do anything to. So I would urge members to support my amendments, and I consequently will move Amendment 105 and Amendment 348, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 105 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division, and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 105 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 27, no 91. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 348 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 105. Edward Mountain, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 348 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 348 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 28, no 89. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We move to Group 29, Rent Reviews. I call Amendment 349 in the name of Douglas Lumsden, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Douglas Lumsden to move Amendment 349 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And good news, the last group, and I'm not going to speak about pylons either. At stage 2, I lodged amendments relating to the rent review provisions in the bill, and I've worked with the Cabinet Secretary ahead of stage 3 and now bring forward these amendments on this topic, and I wish to thank the Cabinet Secretary and her team for their cooperation. The amendments in my name relate to the matters the Land Court is to either have regard to or not take into account when determining the fair rent for a holding. They make equivalent changes to Section 23 of the Bill relating to 1991 Act tenancies and Section 24 relating to various limited duration tenancies. Amendment 349 and 356 clarify that the Land Court, when determining the fair rent for a holding, is to have regard to the open market rental value of any fixed equipment if it is provided by the landlord and used by the tenant for a non-agricultural purpose. This clarifies that the fixed equipment does not need to have been provided by the landlord specifically for a non-agricultural purpose for its rental value to be taken into account. Amendments 351, 354, 355, 358, 361 and 362 address how improvements to the holding are taken into account when determining the rental value, depending on whether these have been paid for by the landlord or tenant or on a shared basis. The amendments provide that the Land Court will not take into account the proportionate amount of the increase in the rental value corresponding to the proportion of the cost of the improvements made at the tenant's expense and at the landlord's expense if they receive grant funding. The amendments also set out further detail on what is classed as being at the tenant's expense for these purposes. This includes, for example, that an improvement is still regarded as being at the tenant's expense wholly or partially, depending on how it was funded when the tenant receives a grant, and the adoption of higher farming standards by the tenant are classed as an improvement wholly at the tenant's expense. Amendments 350, 352, 353, 357, 359 and 360 make consequential and related modifications to streamline the drafting of and consolidate the matters that the Land Court is not to take into account when determining the fair rent for the holding. This will also mean that the related powers in the bill for Scottish ministers to make further provision for these purposes will extend to all these matters. And I ask that the members support the amendments in my name, and I move Amendment 349, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, and I call on the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 229 and other amendments in the group.
The amendments in this group build on the important changes to the rent review process for tenant farmers and their landlords in the bill. Now, Douglas Lumsden's amendments mainly relate to points raised at stage 2 that I've been pleased to work with them to address at stage 3. And as explained by Douglas Lumsden, these amendments provide clarity in relation to the matters the Land Court is to have regard to or not take into account when determining the fair rent for a holding. They do cover important points, including the principle that a tenant's rent should not be increased as a result of improvements that have been carried out at their expense. Now, Amendments 229 and 230 in my name relate to the powers in the bill for ministers to make further provision on the matters the Land Court is to have regard to or take no account of in determining the fair rent of the holding. They modify the description of the consultation duty on Scottish ministers prior to laying draft regulations under the powers to ensure drafting consistency. It is important that the rent review process is fair and there is clarity for tenants and landlords regarding how rent is to be calculated, including what is to be taken into account. And these amendments ensure that the bill achieves this. I therefore ask that members support all the amendments in this group.
Thank you. I call Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as this is the last group in the Land Reform Bill, I propose to make some general comments on this and on another matter. Presiding Officer, I'm in support of amendments in my group by my colleague Douglas Lumsden, which are in response to concerns raised at stage 1 and 2 regarding gaps in the rent review provisions. Mr Lumsden's amendments 349 to 362 add in reasonable provisions that improvements to the land made by the tenant should not be taken into account by the Land Court when rental value of the holding is being determined. I do not support the amendments 229 and 330 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Both these amendments change the Minister's regulating powers so that they can make further provisions by way of regulations on 91 and 2003 Act tenancies with regard to rent reviews. As I have detailed in my copious previous comments on the matter, I am fundamentally opposed to ministers retrospecting adjusting agricultural tenancies because I believe those kind of changes are killing off the rental sector. Now, Presiding Officer, my experience of doing rent reviews is usually a process which I've seen happen on many times. Usually involves the tenant and the landlord sitting around a kitchen table, usually with some home baking and or a bottle of whisky. At the end of the process, neither party has achieved exactly the figure they want, but a fair compromise has been reached, and that's what I would like to see. Now, Presiding Officer, as this is the last group of amendments, I'd like to take a little moment to remind the Cabinet Secretary of a seldom used rule under standing orders of this Parliament. Under Rule 9.8, Sections 6, 7 and 8, before the Stage 3 debate, the member in charge of the bill may by motion propose that such parts of the bill be referred back to the committee for further Stage 2 consideration. Presiding Officer, I'd like to propose that the Cabinet Secretary take responsibility for the substantive changes that have been made to the bill and send Part 1 of the bill, as well as Sections 10, 10A to D, 11, 12, 13, 23 and 24 back to the committee for further consideration. I'll give way to Mr Whitfield, Presiding Officer.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Edmund Mount for giving way in on that point. And this is a case where we've had a number of pieces of legislation that have spread over a number of weeks, a number of sitting sessions where we've had stage 3s, where the completion of the bill has been unknown, really, as we enter into the stage 3 debate. And there have been circumstances where perhaps we would have wished as a chamber it to be other way. And the reason that sits behind the provision in the standing order is to allow the member who is in charge of the bill to really take account of where the position is that the bill is in before going to the stage 3 debate, after which it can't be amended, and may well indeed prevent some of the consequences that the member himself has spoken of rushed legislation in the past.
Edward Mountain.
Mr Whitfield for those comments, and I think that's entirely right, because the bill has changed fundamentally since it was introduced to the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. That's why I suggest that there should be further consideration. And so that there is no doubt, I do this as an individual, although I am a member of that committee. As the Land Reform Bill has fundamentally changed, I believe it is a bill now which could fundamentally harm the sector and will not fulfil the key objectives which the Cabinet Secretary laid out at the beginning of the year which will strengthen the rights of communities to diversify land ownership and for use of land for environmental purposes, and to modernise the legal framework for tenant farmers. I therefore believe, Presiding Officer, that referring the bill back to the committee is the only appropriate step which would ensure that the provisions are sufficiently considered as the bill has been amended, because they cannot be seen as a whole as they are being passed at the moment. I believe there are benefits, Presiding Officer, for this. It would allow the Cabinet Secretary to defend themselves against expensive legal challenges that I believe will inevitably follow, especially in relation to Part 1, and I hear are already being mooted. I will give way, Mr Stewart.
Kevin Stewart.
Mr Mountain for giving way, Presiding Officer. But what we are seeing here today is a mockery being made of the system. Now, it was quite clear to some of us previously that folk were unhappy with this bill and wanted to put the kibosh on it. And this is an example of the kind of nonsense that is taking place in this Parliament. To use Mr Lumsden's phrase of the day, this is a mega monster mockery that Mr Mountain is putting forward.
Edward Mountain.
Well, do you know, Presiding Officer, I'm very proud that I stand in the Parliament as a parliamentarian to point out to the Cabinet Secretary what rules are available to the Cabinet Secretary to consider before we get to stage 3. The point of this Parliament is to produce good legislation, and all I'm saying, Presiding Officer, is I don't think we've achieved that, and I would wish the Cabinet Secretary...
Let's hear Mr Mountain.
I would wish the Cabinet Secretary to at least consider the options that are available to her under the standing orders of these Parliament, which I constantly adhere to, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And I call Douglas Lumsden to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 349.
Nothing to add, and I will press 349.
Thank you. And the question is that Amendment 349 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and we conclude our Stage 3 proceedings today at this point. And we then move on to the final item of business at our decision time of 10 p.m. after our session debating today's Land Reform Bill. There is one question to be put as a result of today's business, and I appreciate that it has been a long session, and I thank members for their courteous contributions. But as I say, there's one question to be put as a result of today's business. And we will get to that question momentarily. Thank you, colleagues. We move to decision time this evening, and I put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion 19487, in the name of Bob Doris, on the Social Justice and Social Security Committee debate, financial considerations when leaving an abusive relationship, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed, and that concludes decision time, and I close this meeting.